Okay, so after all the Christmas festivities ended, it's kind of this odd thing, right? We know how much suffering there was going on in the rest of the world, and here Churchill and Roosevelt are kind of hanging out at the White House at Christmas, making their plans. Um, yeah, it almost seems kind of laid back, except for the fact that there was all this suffering going on. But after Christmas, the two governments sat down and they met formally in the Arcadia Conference. And I want to point out something. We take for granted that Great Britain and the U.S. would have fought Hitler in an alliance. We shouldn't take that for granted. It's pretty amazing that these two established powers would unite to fight a common enemy without a treaty. There was never any treaty between the two. It was informal in that regard, although it was it was a tight alliance. So they came together with the common goal of defeating the Germans first and then the Japanese. Marshall wins a major victory at Arcadia in the sense that he's successful in persuading Roosevelt to create a unified command in Europe, that there'd be one commander over all the national armies. This had not been true in World War I. Every national army in World War I had its own commander. And this caused all kinds of problems during World War I, and Marshall saw that and he knew it. And it was one of his top priorities that there be unified command in World War II, and he was victorious. And ultimately, the commander of U.S. forces in World War II would be an American, Dwight D. Eisenhower, although the British were very, very well represented in the high command of the Allied effort against Hitler. And the other thing is, Arcadia formalized the idea that the bulk of U.S. forces would be thrown against Hitler, while at the same time beginning the campaign against the Japanese, and that once Hitler was defeated, then the full force of the Allies would move against Japan. This probably is pretty obvious, but I'll say it anyway. In the Pacific, the U.S. did most of the fighting, especially the Central Pacific, MacArthur's campaigns up into the Philippines. It was a U.S. show with some token British presence. Now in Burma, the British had they played a very, very important role. They had an excellent general there, General Slim, who was probably the best general in the British Army. So in places like Burma, the British were very significant. But on the whole, the Pacific was a U.S. show. So, and another thing that's worth saying is when push came to shove, Roosevelt was pretty diplomatic about it. But when push came to shove, Roosevelt always had the final word. It's not like he would tell Churchill what to do. Churchill was a glad hander. He kind of hid his power in this kind of very jovial persona. But the U.S. was just more powerful than Great Britain. And also it was gaining more power. Basically, most of the British supplies came from the U.S. The U.S. had the biggest army in Europe. So I think what happened is the Churchill and the British military leaders, as the war went on, they really felt their second-class status. They realized that they weren't top dog anymore, which they'd really been for a century. And this caused a lot of tension between the two countries. Okay, so what happens next is that the fight becomes how best to defeat Hitler. And this is very, very important because it's not as clear-cut. It wasn't as clear-cut at the time as it is now. Marshall and the U.S. military, they wanted a direct thrust across the British Channel into France and into northern Germany as soon as possible. If Marshall had had his way, that would have happened in 1942 or 1943 instead of 1944. This is what the U.S. wanted. This is a U.S. military doctrine. They wanted a cross-channel invasion as quickly as possible. They wanted to go after the jugular of Hitler as soon as they could. Churchill and the British Army, this is not what they want. As I've said before, they're very, very concerned about a cross-channel invasion very quickly becoming a quagmire, a revisit of trench warfare that had existed during World War I. And so they're really worried about the cross-channel invasion, and Churchill does everything in his power to put the brakes on the cross-channel invasion. If Churchill had had his way, Germany would have been invaded through Italy, which didn't really work, through Eastern Europe. He didn't want a direct cross-channel invasion. He wanted to kind of encircle Germany, but that didn't happen. So there's two interesting aspects of this. Churchill was right in one respect, and that was on the question of timing. To invade Germany, cross-channel invasion, what became D-Day on June 6, 1944. If it had happened in 43 or 42, it would have been a catastrophe. The Allies just were not ready. It's going to take a couple of years to ship over all these goods to Great Britain to build up Great Britain as this huge training area, an area of deployment of troops. Think about Code Girls, how many ships are getting sunk, merchant ships, well into 1942, 1943. That issue has to be solved. So Churchill's right about timing. It would have been crazy to invade France before 1944. It just would have been a catastrophe. I can't imagine any scenario in which it would have worked. Okay, so score one for Churchill. But Churchill's completely wrong in the sense that Germany could have been encircled. It was a complete pipe dream. For one thing, if you look at the map of Europe, there's a lot of high ground that Allied forces would have had to traverse to get into Germany. It's impossible to think about how that would have happened. And Churchill's idea of kind of encircling Germany, that's a complete pipe dream. And the cross-channel invasion is really the best way to do it. And Marshall was very confident, the Americans were very confident that with the new technologies, especially tanks, troop transport, jeeps, the kind of mobility that the Allied armies had that had not existed in World War I, the war would not devolve into trench warfare as it happened during World War I. So they were very confident that Churchill's fears were misplaced. But it was a major, major fight between the Allies and the Americans, especially the timing of the cross-channel invasion. And Churchill's not so hidden agenda that he doesn't want a cross-channel invasion. He would rather really do almost anything than a cross-channel invasion. It was almost a phobia for him and the British military because they were so scarred about what had happened in World War I, and they were just terrified that the same thing would happen in World War II, and they just couldn't imagine how Great Britain could survive that, for a second time in 20 years. So to repeat, the issue of the cross-channel invasion, it wasn't a slam dunk. Churchill was doing everything he could to come up with other scenarios besides a cross-channel invasion. The Americans were pushing hard for it, but they were being naive in trying to push for it quickly. If it had happened in 42 or 43, it would have been a disaster. And ultimately, it doesn't happen until 1944. So this is one of the take-home points from this course, the argument between the British and the Americans about the best strategy for defeating Hitler.